very interesting contrast between the two different films. So the way I describe these films are, one of them is a foundation story. So this is a foundation story about Nike. This is us. And the hero of the foundation story is you, the company, the entrepreneur, the designer, the inventor. You are the hero of this story. And the reason why you tell a foundation story is to establish some kind of reputation or trust or credibility. Don't worry, you can trust me, I'm good at this. Right? That's the point of a foundation story. The other one is more like a brand story. And in the brand story, the customer becomes the hero. And your role in that story is as a mentor or supporter. You're not Luke, you're Yoda. Take a Star Wars analogy. In this story, the customer is great. Oh, by the way, he's wearing our shoes. It's very much more subtle. Now, what I'd like you to think about is what kind of stories do you tell yourself about your work? Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other. Clearly, the 1980s were crap, and but no, it's not that simple. You do need both. What your job is to work out is which you need in which situation with which audience, and how to tell them in such a way. So I'll give you an example. Working with startups and entrepreneurs, they fall in love with their own foundation story quite often, and they will go on and on and on about their journey. And I've watched, again, in a pitch situation with investors in the room, an entrepreneur who only had 15-minute slot talking for 9 minutes about himself, right? And his journey to where he got to today. And I'm thinking after the first 2 minutes, I get it. I get it, you work hard. Right? That's all I need to know. Move on. Tell me, what have you got that I might want? What have you got that's going to work for customers? Because that's where I'm interested in. So it's a fine balance. It'll vary. There's no hard and fast rule to it, when to use a foundation story, when to use a brand story. It'll vary depending on what you need to get out of that conversation, who you're talking to. Foundation stories establish a kind of rapport. So in a foundation story, if you like, the moral of the story is, you can trust me. And the story is about how we got here, we the company. So when you're talking about Doc, you're talking about Accenture, you're talking about Fjord, you'll need to use some kind of foundation story. This is why we're here today. But you can only really tell one foundation story. And you can't go on about it for too long. People who talk about themselves for too long, we have a word, a name for those people, and we call them boring. Right, so you cannot do too much on a foundation story. Whereas the brand stories, the moral of the brand story is, you can do this. You can do this with a bit of help from us, but you can do it. You have as many brand stories as you have customers. So every time you do a project, every time you work with a client, every time you complete something, you've got a new brand story. Okay? So you never, as long as you have plenty of customers, you never run out of stories. Okay? Not only can you have your stories, you can have your colleagues' brand stories. You never run out. There's something nice about the brand story as well, which is by shining the light on your customers' achievements, actually the reflected light is bouncing back on you, showing you in a good light. But it's not as big I am. Foundation stories are like, look at me. Whereas the brand stories are more, look at these guys. Oh, by the way, we helped them. It's much more subtle. Now, what I'd like to do is to move on to specifically to think about emotion in stories. Because I think emotion acts almost like it's like a lightning conductor, which will take you to the heart or the root of the story. If you find the emotion, you will find the story beneath it. So I've worked with clients in the past where they've said to me, look, Steve, I just don't think I've got any stories. I do stuff, I do stuff all the time, but I can't see where's the story? So what inevitably we do is we end up talking about emotional moments, and that's where the story is. So it's like a lightning conductor, takes you down to the story. So what I want to talk about in this session, and this will probably be all we've got time for, is emotional cues for innovation stories. Because that's what you're all working on, directly or indirectly, as you're working on the innovation process. So what are the emotional cues that you could be looking for? Now, are you familiar with the idea of the double diamond, the design thinking idea of double diamond? So kind of some nods, some shakes. Okay, to those of you who have not come across this before, it's a kind of innovation process model. So the idea is from the British Design Council. Companies like IDEO have talked about it as well. The idea is that you start with a problem, and that your first job is not to try and solve the problem. Your first job is to discover more about the problem, to do your research, to spend some time defining the problem before you try to solve it. If you rush off and try and solve it, you tend to solve the wrong problem. Okay? After that process, you will probably, hopefully, arrive at a brief. And when you've got a brief, then you can get started on coming up with developing and testing solutions that might actually work, but only once you've spent some time defining the problem. Yes, does that ring a bell with a lot of people? Okay, so it's an interesting model. It's called the double diamond. It's out there. Right. The second piece of work I want to introduce you to is a piece of work by a guy called Charles Burnett called An Emotional Basis for Design Thinking. And what he's suggesting is that there are various emotional stages we go through that relate to this design thinking process. And I'm going to talk you through them and see whether, what I'll be interested from you is, does this ring true? Because I haven't actually tested this with any other designers yet, so I'll be very interested to see. So what he's suggesting is, at the beginning of this process, you may find yourself in a happy or unhappy state. Now, what's interesting is when you're talking about a problem, we're going to talk about positive and negative emotions. People often try to avoid the negative emotions, and this is absolutely wrong. Negative emotions have a very, very important part to play in our lives and in this process. If nobody was unhappy with a situation, nothing would change. Clients come to you because they're not happy about something. You see a problem that you want to work on because you're not happy about it. So the entrepreneur I was dealing with was not happy that women were undergoing abuse on public transport. Yes? So without unhappiness, nothing would change. So even though it's a negative emotion, it's really, really important. So that's the beginning of the process, is identifying something you or a client is unhappy with. Delight and disgust are the next emotions along the chain. So the delight comes from you're starting looking into a problem and you're finding stuff that fits. And you're thinking, oh, great, hey, this is really interesting. Oh, that confirms what I was hoping. So we all know that experience when we start researching a problem, we start finding stuff that fits. It's actually quite exciting. We feel delight. Alternatively, if it doesn't fit, it kind of makes us feel the opposite. Feel disgust, feel uneasy about it. Going on further through, if things are provoking, we're curious, we're really involving the research, really enjoying the research stage, we feel that kind of enthusiasm. Enthusiasm in the creative process, people who've studied creative process, these positive emotions of enthusiasm are really good for curiosity. They really encourage people to spread their wings and explore really unusual and lots of ideas. Lots of divergent thinking requires that kind of positive, upbeat emotion. Whereas the opposite is, oh my God, what are we doing? This is really difficult. Is it like a kind of a feeling of panic when you're maybe 3 weeks into a project and nothing's coming together? We've all experienced that. Oh God, what are we doing? So that's the opposite emotion. Now, when you get to the stage where you've defined the brief, you go back to the client and they say yes, that's pleasurable, deeply pleasurable, because you've got a good brief. We all love to work on a problem that's really, really clearly set out what we're trying to do. Nothing worse than working on a vague brief. It's horrible. In fact, it's painful to work on a vague brief because nothing is clear. It's all confused. It's a mess. So it gives us pain. The opposite we get is pleasure from a clear, good brief. We know what we're doing. We're off. Into the development stage. When work is flowing, when we're working well, we feel joy. When we are not working well, when things are not flowing, when people are blocking us and obstructing us, we feel anger, we feel frustrated. And when you get to the end, when you deliver the thing you've been asked to deliver, if you've produced a valuable solution, if you've added to the great sum of human knowledge, if you've helped people do things that are valuable, you feel pride. If you know, and we've all done this, that you've produced a worthless piece which has helped no one, really, truly, you feel shame. Yep, we've all done it. We've all just got that piece of work out the door and we do not feel any pride in it whatsoever. When you look back on your month, work, whatever period of time, you look back with love because you think my job is great, or you look back with hate because you think my job sucks. Okay. So what I'm going to ask you to do is, again, turn to the person next to you or the people around you and just work out when have you, in part of your innovation process, when have you felt these emotions? Does this, it's only a schema, it's a model, it's not definitive, but have you felt emotions at these stages that correspond to this model?